Genesis chapter 38 fits right smack dab between Genesis 37 and 39. Well, okay, that's an obvious statement, but Genesis 38 is one of those chapters that just don't seem to belong. In the previous chapter, the Bible started talking about Joseph and what was going to happen to Joseph. And then, boom, we get this chapter. Well, I'll unpack it a little bit, and I was challenged to see if there is a challenge for us in the story. But there is, and that we can see later on. Verse 1 starts, "And it came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brethren and turned in to a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hirah." I'll continue by doing commentary. The verses are 1 to 5. When reading through the book of Genesis, occasionally a chapter is inserted that just doesn't seem to fit. As I just mentioned, 38 is one of those chapters. Another one of those chapters was chapter 36, which gave a list of Esau's genealogy. Again, a chapter just inserted right in, interrupting the story. So, the two main characters in this, there are actually three, but the two main characters is Judah and another person that will be introduced in our next lesson, in verse 6. Though Moses, the writer, didn't know it, and this is why this chapter was put in here. Moses, under inspiration from God, was describing the genealogy from which Jesus, the Messiah, would come, part of that genealogy. The story starts off by saying, "It came to pass at that time." We don't know what that time was. We figure it was a time before they moved to Egypt, or a time before the famine started, that we will read later on. A story that almost every Sunday school child is aware of. So, Judah went down from his brethren and turned in to a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hirah. So Adullam is a city. It was one of the main cities of the Canaanites. So why is that important? It's to show that Hirah, who no longer lived in Adullam, was 100% Canaanite. Yep, he was a Canaanite. Now Judah, who was not a Canaanite, turned into Hirah. Now that was a fancy way of saying that he fell in with him. He partnered with him. He got into business with him. And he befriended him. Wow. Turned in has so many connotations in Hebrew, doesn't it? It also said that Judah went down from his brothers. What that is telling us is that when he went down from his brothers, He separated himself from his brothers, and he was acting alone. The Bible makes it so clear that that's what was happening. Why? We will find out by the end of the chapter. Wherever Judah was at with Hirah, he suddenly spied a beautiful Canaanite woman. She was the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. And the Bible says he took her, went in unto her. Now Shua, that name means wealth, great riches, wealth. Shua means wealth. And he was described as a certain Canaanite. A certain Canaanite means that he was probably a noteworthy man in the community, a man that everybody knew, a certain Canaanite named Shua. Maybe it was a voluntary merging of families as Judah wanted to join that family or not, I don't know. But Judah fell in love and married a Canaanite woman. Now, why would he do that? This was strictly forbidden by Abraham and Isaac. Remember Ishmael. He married a Canaanite woman and never was the same since. Esau, same thing. So why would Judah do this? This merging with the Canaanite customs was strictly forbidden by Abraham and Isaac and avoided by his father Jacob. Most probably, well aware of his family history, Judah entered into a relationship which nonetheless was condemned by God. Somebody who was reading this with me said, you see, Barney? They're racist. Oh, really? Why? Because, look at that, they were forbidden to marry people that were outside of their inner circle. Ha! They're racist. I have an answer to this. No. What was happening was, when you married outside of your culture, which believed in only one God, and you married into another culture which believed in many gods, there was definitely going to be a clash happening. You see, the people with many gods might say, okay, I'll accept your God, but then they put God on a shelf and say, okay, I'll worship him, and I'll worship her, and I'll worship her, and I'll worship him, and I'll worship your God too. Okay? It doesn't work like that. So the woman was never identified whom Judah fell in with and married. But she conceived and bare a son, and Judah called the name of that son Er, meaning watchful. Not long after was born, she conceived again and bare him a son, but she called him Onan, meaning strong. You see, people were named within the circumstances they were in at the time. We don't know yet what real circumstances there were, but we'll find out these names meant nothing. And she yet again conceived, giving him, Judah, a third child. And she conceived again and bore a son and called his name Shelah, meaning rest or pause. She named this child too. The verse closes with, he was at Shezib when she bore him. The reason of Judah and her being here in Shezib at the time of her delivery, we never find out. This detail, this added detail, was never made clear to us why they were there. But folks, what is made very clear in this chapter is that God was very displeased in this whole chapter. You'll find that out. Folks, be careful who you intermingle with. Do you realize that the New Testament even talks about it? Paul said, do not be unequally yoked, because you're going to have trouble. That's not talking about between races. It's talking about between different cultures where you're going to mix up your belief in one God with idolatry. More on this